You've never had a panic attack about being ignored. You've never needed someone to reply quickly to feel okay. And when something goes wrong, your first instinct isn't to call someone. It's to go quiet. Most people would call that cold. Psychologists would call it something entirely different. And by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly where it came from, because it wasn't random. It wasn't a personality flaw, and it wasn't something that happened to you by accident. It was built into you by time, by history, by a very specific set of years that no generation before or after you will ever experience again. You're a Xennial, born roughly between 1977 and 1985.
You've never fully fit anywhere generationally. Too young for Gen X, the real skeptics, the ones who checked out before the game even started. Too old for core millennials, the generation that learned to process feelings in public before they'd finished feeling them. You sat in the middle, and that in-between space built something very specific in you. You had an analog childhood and a digital adulthood. That gap, that precise, unrepeatable window of time, is the origin of almost everything unusual about how you handle your inner life. It wasn't your parents and wasn't your personality. It was timing, pure, accidental, deeply formative timing. Think about what boredom actually felt like when you were young. Not the restless, scrolling kind. Real boredom, long and quiet and slightly uncomfortable. No phone in your pocket, no algorithm deciding what you should feel next, no friend available to absorb your mood in real time. Just you and whatever was happening inside your own head. Here's what that quietly does to a person. It forces internal processing. When something upset you, there was no comment section to validate it, no group chat to workshop your reaction, no one immediately confirming whether what you felt was normal or relatable. You sat with it. You figured it out, alone. You processed confusion, hurt, and frustration without an audience, over and over again, long before anyone ever gave that process a name. There was no instant validation loop. Problems didn't have Google. Emotional confusion didn't have a thread with hundreds of reassuring replies. You developed your own answers. And slowly, without realizing it, you built something most people today never have the quiet space to build, an internal emotional architecture, a steady foundation that didn't require external approval to function. You learned to regulate yourself before you ever learned to perform yourself. That's the first layer, and it's more significant than it sounds. Because once that pattern formed, once processing feelings privately became your default, it stopped being a choice. It became a reflex. And reflex is far harder to unlearn than habit. Which is exactly why you're still doing it today, without thinking, without noticing, and without realizing just how rare it truly is. Now, layer in something even more important. You went through adolescence, the most emotionally volatile period of human life, without a permanent record. Embarrassment faded, it didn't go viral. A fight with a friend happened, and then it ended. It wasn't screenshotted or replayed indefinitely. You tried on different versions of yourself, different clothes, different groups, different ideas about who you were. None of it was archived. You were allowed to be inconsistent. You were allowed to grow in private. And what that creates psychologically is something rare, internal identity formation. You didn't build your sense of self based on how many people responded to you. You built it through lived experience, what actually happened, how you actually felt, what you quietly decided about yourself when no one was watching. That is fundamentally different from growing up in performance culture, where identity is shaped by audience response, measured by engagement, and constantly updated for external approval. You had privacy during the years when identity is most fragile, and that privacy built something in you that couldn't be dismantled later. Then the internet arrived, and it didn't arrive gently. You hit your early 20s and everything accelerated. Internet, early social media, cell phones, entire systems beginning to break down. Then the Great Recession hit right as you were trying to build a life.
The ground shifted, repeatedly, without warning. Here's what's psychologically significant about that timing. You adapted to massive, disorienting change while you were still forming your adult identity. There was no stable system to hold you up. You figured it out, you adjusted, you rebuilt. And when you do that enough times, something quietly changes inside you. You stop waiting to be rescued. That's not bitterness, that's not cynicism. It's something quieter and far more useful: emotional flexibility. A low dependency on things staying the same. A trained capacity to stabilize yourself when external circumstances won't. So here's what all of that actually builds in a person. You don't constantly broadcast your feelings. You don't need an immediate reply to feel secure in a relationship. You can go hours, sometimes full days, without checking in with anyone, and it doesn't trigger anxiety. When something difficult happens, your first instinct is to process internally before saying anything at all. You self-soothe, quietly, without an audience. You value privacy almost instinctively, not because you're hiding something, but because privacy has always felt like safety. And here's where this circles back to the very beginning. You think all of this is completely normal. You genuinely assume that everyone operates this way. You don't experience your emotional independence as a trait. You experience it as just how humans work. That gap between who you actually are and how you see yourself is the entire point of this. You were trained by very specific circumstances to become emotionally self-sufficient. And that training was so gradual, so quiet, that you never once noticed it happening.
But here's something that needs to be said honestly. Emotional independence is not a flaw, but it does carry a shadow. The same wiring that keeps you calm in a crisis can make it genuinely difficult to ask for help. The same self-sufficiency that keeps you stable can quietly become hyper-responsibility, the belief that you should be able to handle everything, always, alone. The person who looks most composed in a room full of anxiety is often the one silently carrying the heaviest load. When things get hard, your default isn't to reach out. It's to internalize, to manage, to tell yourself you're fine before you've actually stopped to check. "I'll handle it" becomes both your greatest strength and your most reliable defense mechanism. You don't have to exhaust every other option before deciding you deserve support. Naming that pattern doesn't mean something is broken. It means you now have a choice. The same way you built emotional independence unconsciously, you can build emotional openness intentionally. Here's how this fits into the bigger picture. Gently. Gen X carries a kind of emotional skepticism, a quiet, inherited distrust of feeling too much. Millennials move toward emotional expression, naming feelings, sharing them, processing them out loud. Neither approach is wrong. Neither is complete. Xennials sit between both. You have the adaptability that comes from navigating genuine uncertainty, and you have the emotional intelligence to know what you feel. You just rarely feel the need to announce it. That makes you something specific in the generational landscape. A bridge. Not the loudest voice in the room, not the most expressive, but often the most steady, the clearest, the one people quietly turn to when things get difficult. You don't generate noise, you generate steadiness. You didn't become emotionally independent because you were hardened. You weren't trained to be cold or damaged into distance. You became emotionally self-sufficient because you learned to be alone before you were ever truly connected. You adapted before you had the option to depend. You stabilized before the world gave you a stage to perform your instability on. Every quiet moment of childhood boredom was an act of internal processing. Every embarrassment that faded instead of going viral was a quiet act of resilience. Every adjustment you made through years of disorienting change was a small act of emotional strength you never thought to name. You weren't distant. You weren't closed off.
You were emotionally trained by timing, by circumstance, by a world that moved slowly enough to teach you how to feel things quietly, and then fast enough to prove you could survive the shift. Most people will never fully understand that about you, but now you do. If this resonated, if it named something you've always lived but never had words for, consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it too. They probably won't ask, but then again, that's kind of the whole point.